What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological ingredients. That's interviews with theologians, philosophers, historians, biblical scholars, all to put in that little earbud you got on so you can think, wrestle, and brew your own faith. That's right. And today on the podcast, we have the Reverend Dr. Daniel Joslyn-Siemiatkoski. That's right. He is a professor of church history at Seminary of the Southwest, which is an Episcopal seminary in Austin, Texas. And we're going to talk today about a number of things. One, his really awesome new book in comparative theology called More Torah, More Light, a Christian commentary on the Mishnah Avot. That's right, on part of the written expression of the oral Torah for the Jewish people. So that's like already pretty enticing, right? And then we end up talking about some history of the Episcopal Church, weird Anglican Twitter, and a host of other little ideas. So get ready for a lot of fun, because this is a good one. Before we jump in, I want to make sure everyone here has gotten a thorough, welcoming, inviting even invitation to the Black Theology Reading Group. That's right. We just kicked it off. You're more than welcome to catch up. It'll be running through August and September here at Homebrewed Christianity. And to join me and Dr. Adam Clark, Monica A. Coleman, Jesse Jackson, and because we have our wonderful partners, the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, we're going to be joined by the bishop, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry. All that's happening. All you have to do to join is go to jamescohnwasright.com. jamescohnwasright.com. This is an open course. Anyone and everyone can join. You can donate what you can or nothing. What we really want to do is, in this time where the country is reflecting and wrestling with issues of justice, white supremacy, racism, and things, is to get the resources that this particular tradition has cultivated into the imaginations of as many people as possible, so we can move forward together. So go to jamescohnwasright.com and look forward to some more exciting fun. Lastly, I want to give a big shout out to all the Homebrewed Christianity community members. They are the people that donate each month to keep this podcast going. They went to homebrewedcommunity.com, signed up, and then they got invited to the personal Facebook group of all of the members. They got a private podcast feed that has a whole host of classes, lectures, live hangouts, and such right there into their earbud. Oh yeah, they get a bunch of fun stuff. But they also get to go to bed at night knowing that they are part of bringing this theological goodness to the masses. So thank you. Now, before we jump into my amazing conversation with Dan, here's a word from this week's sponsor. This week's episode is sponsored by the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church. Oh yeah, hsec.us. That's where they exist on the internet. And if you like history, or even religious history, then you might want to just go check them out. You see, the Episcopal Church was founded shortly after the American Revolution with the remnant of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. 34 Anglicans signed the Declaration of Independence. At least 24 went to the Constitutional Convention. And the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, organized in 1910, is here to promote and preserve that particular Episcopal Church heritage here in America. Since 1932, it's published a scholarly peer-reviewed journal with research, book reviews, church reviews. And the Society continues publishing newsletter and articles for people in the pews and planning every 3 years a conference themed around a different part of its history. If you have any interest in religious history, you'll want to check out the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, hsec.us. And if you're really interested, consider becoming a member. Support the Society's continued work at, what is it? Oh, it's hsec.us. for the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church. Yeah, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and I'm on the podcast with Daniel Joslyn-Siemiatkoski. And you may be saying to yourself, wow, did he just nail that on his first try? I practiced, and I cheated, and had some coaching, but it's okay. He's not only a minister, he's an educator, and he is professor of church history at Seminary of the Southwest, which is the Episcopal Seminary in Austin, Texas. So thank you for joining the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Tripp. Happy to be here.
Oh, yeah. So you have a really, really fascinating book that's about to come out where you do comparative theology, and you're doing comparative theology by writing a commentary on another religious tradition's sacred text.
Right.
So basically, that's like saying like you're pretty hardcore for a nerd, right?
Yeah.
You don't say yes to that book contract unless you got some gumption in you.
Or if you're a doctoral student in his last year and a professor asks you to write it.
Well, that's one, but let's lean into the confidence you must have in your ability to nuance ancient texts and multiple religious traditions. When someone suggests that book to you, there's a story in that, right? So when you go to when you end up writing a commentary on another religious tradition, that's bringing together a whole number of different fields of study. So how did you as an individual decide to both become ordained within your tradition, but also become a scholar in it? Like, where was the origin story of your vocation?
Wow, that goes way back. I was raised in the church, United Methodist Church. I grew up in Windsor, Connecticut, just near Hartford. My church, I was raised in the 70s and 80s, was actually part of the third wave charismatic renewal movement, right? So we have prophesying and speaking in tongues. For Methodists, we were pretty conservative in my neck of the woods. We were part of the New York district, and our pastor taught us on premillennial dispensationalism and all kinds of...
So y'all had charts.
Oh, man, we had charts. We read Frank Peretti, whole 9 yards, this present darkness, all that. But, I had a real strong pull to church. Church was an anchor for me. My family life sometimes was hectic, and church was safe. It was an anchor. I was always welcomed there, and I love services. And, Methodists, we do communion once a month, right? Mm-hmm. First Sunday of the month. And I just love the communion service. That was my favorite. Most people would complain because they're cutting to the kickoff time for football games. So, my pastor had long sermons also, but
he didn't dial the sermon back for Communion Sunday.
Oh man! Once he was in the pulpit, and he said, "The parish pastor relations committee just put a clock on the back of the wall there." He points to the back corner and says, "But I'm not looking at it."
Oh, that's confident. I worked at a UCC church in Los Angeles, and so we did the communion once a month, and you could get 18 to 20 minutes on no communion Sundays, but communion Sundays you had 12 minutes, and they just hated if I was the one preaching because there were three of us, because they're like, Tripp's from the South. He's barely started at 12 minutes. And every time I guest preach at an Episcopal service, I just tell myself, it's not a sermon, it's a reflection.
Yeah. Here's the thoughts you have.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I just always have strong call to life in the church. When I was going off to college, I went to Gordon College as an undergraduate. That's an evangelical school in Wenham, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. I met with, by then we had another pastor in the church. And my mom set up a meeting between us because I told her I was interested in ministry. And he said something to me that was really not what I was expecting at all. He said, don't get ordained unless you absolutely have to. And at 18, I didn't know what that meant. Right. But I took the under advisement, went to Gordon College. And by then I was thinking, what would be cool to do would be to be a seminary professor. I had no idea what seminary was all about. It's just like you get these ideas in your head, right? I was like, I think I want to get a PhD. I think I want to study religion somehow. So I really just put my nose to the grindstone in college and by the end, I had become an Episcopalian. I had done my junior year abroad at Oxford University, worshiping at Pusey Chapel, a high Anglo-Catholic place, and had become Anglican and was confirmed into the Episcopal Church my senior year of college. And by then, I was like, I just went straight into a master's program at Boston College, Jesuit University. And I took some time off. And I discerned that getting ordained right away didn't make a whole lot of sense. At age 25, I didn't think I had any business handling anything about anyone else's spiritual life, much less my own. So I went to a doctoral program back at Boston College. And 2005, went to teach at Seminary at Church Divinity School of the Pacific, which is an Episcopal Church seminary in Berkeley, California. I was happily a lay person, happily living out a lay vocation as a church historian, comparative theologian. But the call to ordained ministry came back to me, and some mentors who discerned some workings of God in my life. And so I was ordained to the priesthood about 2.5 years ago now. So kind of the fusion has finally happened of the ordained life and the seminary professor life. Feels like a good place to be in.
And so what was it about the Episcopal Church itself that coming out of the charismatic tradition that became the place you not just felt at home as a layperson, but were called vocationally to serve? A lot of it for me was about leaving the culture of evangelicalism, the culture of American evangelicalism, which I didn't really realize what that was until I got to Gordon College. And then you're kind of just immersed in kind of a stew of it. And really, I think there's a lot of people, right, that have that experience because you usually just go to the church you go to. And there's plenty of evangelical churches whose pastor kind of dodges half of the crazy stuff, and you have a real positive experience. You don't know any other options. And then you get to a Christian college, and all of a sudden, everyone's trying to out-Jesus each other. And then the crazy parts get celebrated, and or the ones that can play 3 chords on a guitar.
Right. I drifted more towards 3 chords on a guitar and tried to dodge the crazy as much as I could. There was a sense of why can't culture just be culture? Why do we need to have this separate Christian culture? Why do we need Christian music? Why do we need Christian art? And I think we had I had great professors at Gordon. I had a really great experience. And I think I was like a lot of evangelicals moving to the Episcopal Church Anglican tradition, where I wanted a sense of something more rooted and grounded. My father's side of the family had been Roman Catholic. My great aunt was a Roman Catholic nun. That draw to the Eucharist was really compelling. And for that to be a weekly celebration was really spiritually significant for me. And that sense of history and tradition of being part of a larger whole. And I think this was much more like implicit for me at that point. But that sense of you don't have to fight between reason and faith. And I think a lot, really some great aspects of the Protestant tradition have worked that out. But like in American evangelical culture, that still seemed like such a, hornet's nest to deal with.
Yeah, you don't like hang out with a bunch of Episcopal priests and find out 3 of them think the earth is 6,000 years old or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So, Charles Darwin was a Church of England deacon.
Yeah.
So we had our flyover here, but hopefully we'll be done soon.
Well, I mean, I really feel like it's important for all podcast listeners to recognize just how amazing it is to be in America. That we have the ability to fly fighter jets all over.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you talk back, we'll probably fly over your country. So
Yep. Yeah, awesome power here.
Yeah. I mean, don't worry. We love freedom and liberty, so we would never impinge on anyone.
We all know how much the Scots love that.
Oh yeah, they love freedom. Yeah, we got a whole. I went to the Wallace Memorial, which is wonderful. Like, have you ever been to it? The William Wallace Memorial. And the whole time I'm going through it, it's like so good. And then I realize
that it's kind of like the equivalent in the United States. If we had a memorial to some like Southern military figure that led an uprising,
like Stone Mountain.
Yeah, something like that. Because like they tried to rebel basically, and they're fighting for independence. And the whole time, though, there's like this nuancing because everybody in the country wants to claim him because he's like a freedom fighter and supports everything. But also the Scottish people on this, writing all the copy on the history stuff, also want everyone to know he really wanted to stick it to England. But then everyone that comes is going to enjoy it because of the movie, and they all love the story and stuff. And it is like halfway through the going up this up the stairs, and each floor of this castle is another like exhibit. I realized there was probably a lot of committee meetings about the copy for this. Because when it gets to his actual documents, he's like, I hope the King of England chokes on his own vomit and stuff like that. So
classy.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm sorry for the side. There's no more planes going now. So, have you? So, in your time in the Episcopal Church, like, have you found other people that have found their way there from either other traditions or people that find their way into the church because of some of the same attractions, the history, the liturgy, the centering on the Eucharist?
Yeah, I think it comes in a couple of different directions. Of course, we have this like terrible phrase, cradle Episcopalians. Our Episcopalians were like baptized into the church. By and large, that's not a great proportion. I think part of being American is switching your religion at least at some point in your life. That's kind of a birthright we have. In my experience, I've been teaching in Episcopal seminaries for about 15 years now. And in my experience, you have this one group that's coming from, let's just call it more conservative Protestant traditions. And that's what they're drawn to. They're drawn to a sense of rootedness, the Eucharistic piety, a sense of something that's lasting and permanent. Where I am now, we have a lot of Stone Campbell movement, Church of Christ sorts of folks who come over because of that pull, Baptists, some. Then there's the other side. There's a significant wing of former Roman Catholics, people who, women who have discerned their call to ordained ministry, people who are burned out by the Roman Catholic Church for whatever reason. And then occasionally we get a few people who grew up with like no religion. And they like discover a tradition that they find appealing. So I think, I heard one bishop once call the Episcopal Church the church of last resort. If no one else will have you, we'll take you. Now, but what's really interesting to me is we're also really kind of clear in a few things. Like, we confess the Nicene Creed as a standard of faith, which is not shared by lots of other people or Protestants as a benchmark necessarily. We have a prayer book whose celebrations within you can't alter because they're like, you're bound to them, right? So despite kind of this attractional pull, we actually have these really interesting bedrock standards that we, at least on paper, we say we're not going to deviate from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been real interesting to me moving from a context of very liberal free church people to hanging out with Scottish Episcopal and Scottish Reformed people, and the way they relate to history and creeds and all that kind of stuff. The first time I preached at chapel, there was a significant email discussion trying to find the details of my ordination as to whether or not we could have the Eucharist. Right. And I was like, I'm Baptist. We were ordained at our baptism. So no, but yeah, good luck with
that one.
Yeah. You're like, come on. The first Baptist is the one that baptized Jesus. That's in his name. So there is this I've interacted with a lot of people who are Americans here doing PhDs who came out of very conservative evangelical situations and found their home in the Anglican communion precisely because it's old and weird.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's so old and weird and different and has almost no interest in competing in the way evangelicals compete for market space of entertainment and space in your life and all this kind of thing. It's like,
I want to tack on to that. I've been doing some reading kind of in the development of Anglicanism in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the things that's really interesting is that prior to let's just call it 1860, Anglicans weren't distinguishable from other Protestants except for the fact of, having bishops subscribing to their prayer book and some other kind of really fundamental things. But this revival in sacramentalism from the Oxford movement, the Anglo-Catholic movement, part of what's happening there is the attractional pull of that is a romantic counterbalance to modernity, right? So like that Anglican, that brand of being old and weird is actually in some ways a production of modernity, right? Mm-hmm. That's part of this dialectical push. And you layer on that the embrace of rationalism at the same time in Anglican theology. So you hold on to the symbol of the creed, but then the bishops will release these statements in the 20th century. It says the interpretation of creeds can be broad. So I have one colleague who describes this as a big garden with high walls.
That sounds about right. Well, I mean, if you just think of all the people who are comfortable and celebrated in the Anglican communion as just scholars or popular preachers, the theological diversity is very high. Yeah. Right? And so there's something about the way the tradition holds its own tradition that's different than, like, Baptists fight if there's a 4-point Calvinist next to a 5-point Calvinist. Like, whatever that 1 point is, like limited atonement, or like they're like once saved, always saved. And those like, no, I don't know. You get these type of things going, and they'll like start cutting people. Episcopal Church is like, yeah, Marcus Borg, he crosses his fingers and sings the creeds, and the Ethiopian Church really thinks it's important. And but it's just such a different. I feel like I'd be interested in how you see it. Like, the theology doesn't function in the same kind of definitional way it does in a kind of a hyper Protestant context.
Yeah. Michael, this is actually from my book where I began talking about an Anglican method. Michael Ramsey, Archbishop of Canterbury in the mid-20th century, he called Anglicanism, contrasting to a systematic theology. He says it's a way, a use, a method, right? So there's a sense that whatever Anglican theology produces there's always this provisional quality to it. There's never kind of a final word. So, we could put John Spong, or we could put Ephraim Radner, Catherine Tanner, John Mbidi, Rowan Williams all together. And all of them as theologians are going to talk about the provisionality at some level of their theological work. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that links back to sacramentality, to incarnation, the sense of that God's work is ongoing in the world. Right? Yeah. Well,
and God's ongoing work in the world doesn't become more vibrant just because you're theologically correct, right? Like, I think that's what other Protestants get worried about. I remember one time sitting at when I grew up Baptist, and before a lot of the Baptist denominations split, you would have in the same local Baptist gathering for like the city or whatever, very progressive, free, like we're a Peace Church Baptist, open and affirming, to fundamentalist, all there. And basically all they do locally is fund orphanages, homeless shelters, things that you would have to get rid of all of the New Testament things Jesus said to not be supporting. But then you would get in the meeting and almost half of it would be discussing like, who's going to feed the homeless and help the kid, because they're so worried about the theology of the person doing it, right?
Yeah.
And that's just a different, I feel like if you grew up in that, the idea that you're going to opt out of that and just do the Eucharist more is really attractive.
Yeah. As you and your listeners know, we got our own problems.
Oh, yeah.
But fortunately, we only meet like once every 10 years. It was going to be 12 years later. Now it's going to be 13 years later since 2008, our last meeting. So that's part of the genius. We just, we do the work on the ground, and we keep our differences at bay enough that we keep moving. Yeah.
So I find it fascinating the idea that the Oxford movement in the 19th century that kind of returned to sacramentality. That makes sense that it's a kind of counterbalance to modernity. Have you read the New York Times piece on
Mere Christianity?
Yeah, being basically like if you're old school Anglican, you're now punk rock for Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I read it, and it sat kind of funny with me. If you hop on my Twitter at Dan Joslyn-Sim, you can follow me there. I dip in and out of what we call weird Anglican Twitter, which is mostly 20 somethings up. Some of us Gen Xers try to participate, but we don't do it as successfully. And I sat with it. I thought, well, what makes me feel weird about this article? And for a lot of it, I'm like, good, this is great, But there's a piece of me that all of a sudden I realized, wait, I've been doing weird Christianity since the early 90s, I was showing up to Pusey House and chanting. I learned the Nicene Creed by chanting it with incense. I said, weird Christianity, it's always been that way. If you're paying attention to Christianity, it's dang weird. You become the body of Christ, and then you proclaim the creation of the body of Christ in your midst by bread and wine, and then you eat the body of Christ, and then you're dismissed out in the world to be Christ to other people. Like, that's weird. We don't need the late great planet Earth and the Left Behind series to get weird. Just being Christian makes you an alien in this world, as the great Episcopal theologian William Stringfellow said in the 60s.
Anglican Twitter, the feisty ones, have a love-hate relationship with me, so they'll at least be glad someone mentioned them on the podcast.
Hashtag what?
I don't know. Half of them are muted. Let's be honest. I mute a lot of people, and I may have sent some trolly responses before. Because
it wouldn't be Twitter if you didn't.
I know. I feel like people, if you don't understand the hermeneutic of social media, like sarcasm, then you can really take the wrong things personally.
Yeah, and I think that's one of our great foibles as Anglicans and Episcopalians is we're really earnest.
So what's your Twitter handle? Because now people are sitting there, they got their phones out because they're listening, and they're like, oh, he's on Anglican Twitter. We got to get on this because
I got to get on that guy. Yeah. So my Twitter is at Dan Joslyn-Sim. So DanJoslynSiem. So, my little profile says everything has a history.
It does.
That's my motto.
I mean, I support it. I think everything has history. And so when you decided to go back for your PhD and stuff, what did you always know you wanted to be a church historian, or like when did of all the different areas you study when you do your master's, did you latch on to history?
Yeah, I latched on to history by the end. By the time I was done with my junior year abroad at Oxford, I was a historian. I went into my junior year abroad wanting to do Old Testament. But of course, at Gordon College, I wasn't taught the critical biblical method. And I got annihilated in my tutorials. This was done by evangelicals. So the British evangelicals were in disbelief that I had not been taught any critical exegesis.
I know. I
years.
always want them to go hang out with some of my family members.
Yeah.
And just be like, you want to know who comes to class more prepared than the professor? The conservative evangelical students, because they have to know everything you think and how to get the closest to historic orthodoxy using things you support when they footnote it. And yeah.
So I got annihilated. At my last tutorial, my first term, my Michaelmas term, I almost cried. It was so bad. So I studied with Benedicta Ward, who was a great scholar of the Desert Fathers and mysticism, and that really got me into church history. But I got into my doctoral program really wanting to study the lives of saints. And I ended up studying historical Jewish-Christian relations through the lens of martyrdom instead. You've done work before on the Maccabean revolt and the way Christians understood their martyrdom? Is that? Yeah. So 2 Maccabees 7 has the story of the martyrdom of the mother and their 7 sons who refused to eat pork, and Antiochus Epiphanes tortures them, and 4th Maccabees is about them. Though that group are the prototypical martyrs for early Christians. And early Christians have their own cult of the Maccabean Martyrs. Which is really tricky, because then Christians have to explain why they're honoring martyrs for the law if Christ abolishes the law, following Paul, right? So I kind of trace out this really complicated hermeneutical theology around law and martyrdom vis-a-vis Jesus and Torah. If you want to find the relics of the Maccabean martyrs today, they are in St. Andrew's or St. Andreas Kirche in Cologne, Germany, near the train station. So you can find the reliquary there in a side chapel. And I did a summer studying there and looking up everything I could about it. So that's kind of my first round of publishing in this area. Yeah.
And so the new book dealing with the Mishnah is, it's the historically adjacent period, right? Like, so if the story of the Maccabees and things is Second Temple period and leading up to the destruction of the temple and the transition into rabbinic Judaism and things after the destruction in 70. For people that are unfamiliar with that historical background, like before digging into how you do comparative theology and exegeting in text and things,
sure.
What are the signposts you put up to set the context for this transition to a Judaism prior and then after the destruction of the temple? Right.
So the book that we're talking about here is The More Torah, the More Life, Christian commentary on Mishnah Avot. Some readers might be familiar with that text known as Pirkei Avot, or sayings or chapters of the Fathers. So some folks might have run across this text in a variety of contexts. It's a collection of wisdom sayings, essentially, or sayings about the value of Torah in Jewish life. So that's like our first clue for signposting, right? Mm-hmm. Is we have a collection of sayings that goes across five chapters and begins from the earliest around. There's these pairs of sayings to the first chapter of our first sayings, probably from about 200 BCE, the first figure, running all the way to about the era of the Bar Kokhba revolt, 130s of the Common Era. So really spanning 300 years or so, and making that transition from pre-Christianity to post-Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. So, and we're following a chain of sayings that are the heads of the Sanhedrin and the Beit Din, or the court for rabbinic law. And we're following the sayings of the two leaders of each of those through a linkage of generations, right? So we're going across maybe about 10 generations here or so. So we're seeing here then a value around communal leadership also. And of course, the real question here is, what is Jewish life prior to the destruction of the temple and after the destruction of the temple, right? Because if we read our Hebrew Bible, we know that the focus of Jewish life and worship is sacrifice in the temple, right? Mm-hmm. That's also really kind of the focus of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. You ever notice how much people are just hanging out in the temple in the New Testament? That's really a big deal. How do you worship God after the temple is gone? And there are a lot of answers to that. One of the telescoping things that happens with Christians is we don't see all of the possible diversity in early Judaism. We just see Pharisees leading to rabbis, leading to the Judaism we know. One of the things I try to highlight is the rabbis are trying to highlight or offer one interpretation of how life should proceed afterwards, and that's following Torah. And it's not just following Torah, because that was also required before that, but that the thing that replaces temple sacrifice is the study of Torah itself. Mm-hmm. That the study of Torah now brings God's presence after it's left the temple, which also means God will be present wherever you study Torah. So God won't only be present in the temple, God will be present in the study house also. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's like a big signposting, right? And the document we're talking about here, Mishnah Avot, is just part of a collection of interpretations of how to live out Torah that was compiled around the year 200 by Rabbi Judah the Patriarch.
If you're trying to give a contemporary, or not contemporary, but a transition that Christians would see as comparable, like what comes to mind?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things I discussed in the introduction to the commentary, is often Christians just see that Christianity as something that simply exists once you have followers of Jesus. But if you study, any of the scholarship and the development of Christianity, of the early history of Jewish-Christian relations, there's like nothing simple or clear about that, right? It's really clear Jesus is a Torah teacher. It's really clear that he, Paul, Peter, all have these expectations of continued Torah observance by Jews who follow Jesus, right? So there is a similar transition happening in the early second century for a variety of reasons. Aspects of Jewish observance and practice are getting pushed out of the Jesus follower movement, and Gentiles are emerging into leadership. We can see the emergence of the notion of an episcopacy, of a church ordered by groupings of bishops in various cities, as analogous to the creation of the authority of rabbis, or the claim for the authority of rabbis, just as bishops are laying claim to authority. The claim to authority by bishops is not obvious. There's other possible ways of structuring early Christianity that
right.
Things like the Gospel of Thomas or the Didache, where you have charismatic authority and episcopal authority.
It is interesting when you look at the history how the destruction of the temple was a game changer for what came to be Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah.
And I don't remember where it is. I took a class in undergrad with a rabbi at UNC that taught in UNC's religion department. And there's a text where the rabbis are upset that James, the brother of Jesus, is in trouble.
Right.
And maybe you obviously will remember more of this than me. I just remember reading when the first time we read that, I was like, this doesn't make sense, because there's one group who are Christians, and then there's the other group, the Jewish people, and now you got the Jewish people are advocating for one Christian while they think the other Christians, the ones that don't want to that aren't worried about getting snipped or not, they really don't like them. And there was this moment where you start reading the text and you go, oh, these are really bad categories to use.
Yeah. So Daniel Boyarin, Paula Fredrickson are two scholars who are really great at helping to untangle all those threads. So that's a story that appears in the Talmud that you just referenced. And it's really it really confuses the categories. And one of the things that I try to foreground in the book and in my scholarship and teaching in general is helping to get Christians to take Judaism on Jewish terms. Mm. Right. So I teach a course called Undoing Anti-Judaism in the church here at the seminary. I co-teach it with a rabbi at the conservative congregation here in town. Conservative is a denomination in American Judaism. His name is Neil Blumoff, great guy, all over the interfaith and arts scene here in Austin. And he and I teach this course together, and it's really helpful to have both a Christian in the room saying, listen, take Judaism on its own terms, and to have a Jewish authority in the room saying, here's what it means to be Jewish on Jewish terms, right? I think this is one of the big problems with Christianity. We can call what it is, which is supersessionism, which is the whole replacement theology where Christians take on all the positive blessings that Israel has and we cast all the negativity back onto Jews. Is part of the Christian bias is to assume because Jesus is the Messiah, we inherently understand what Judaism is about. Right, because we've read the New Testament and the Old Testament, but we don't pay attention to any of the development of Judaism afterwards, which is really what this commentary is trying to do, is to point to what's a really accessible text, to say, look at how Judaism understands itself in some really important categories like revelation, the nature of God, grace, ethical imperatives, right? And so to get a sense of development there. And then I kind of engage in a theological conversation around, what I point out. I'm kind of like Virgil accompanying Dante through the, just saying, hey, look over here. Isn't that interesting to see?
So can you say a bit about the origin, construction, that kind of stuff? Or what are the nuts and bolts of the Mishnah that you think someone would want to have some awareness of before digging in?
You mean the Mishnah as an entire body, or Mishnah Avot?
How would you want to set up the? I guess. Like at the very beginning, right? It tells it gives us his origin story of Moses, and right. You have like the written Torah. Then you also have the oral Torah, and then you have the first couple hundred years post destruction of the temple that are encapsulated there. But like how does the text understand itself, and then how do Jewish scholars today understand itself, and how that text functions for the confessional community, different than sure. Maybe how Christians think a confessional text functions? Yeah. So we have Torah, which is, in English we translate that as law, which is a really terrible translation. Torah means something like instruction, teaching, guidance, given at Sinai, right? And there's in Jewish tradition, there's 613 commandments. We could also use the word mitzvot. And so Judaism, the rabbinic movement is saying, okay, what's essential to Jewish life is the following of all these commandments. Part of what the rabbis are trying to do is to get everyone in the Jewish community, and let's use the word that they use, which is Israel, right? All Israel, to participate in keeping Torah and to keep it to its fullness. Now, the thing here that they're saying is, by doing this, you bring God into your life. So let's see the Pharisees and the earlier rabbinic movement for what it is. It's a holiness movement. I was raised in Wesleyanism. That's holiness, right? And the holiness movements really emphasize being scrupulous, paying attention to what you're doing. So the rabbis then begin to get the question, well, how do we keep some of these commandments? And so what the Mishnah is
there's several different collections of tractates in the Mishnah. I believe around 63 total in the whole body of the Mishnah, where they go through their various categories of law. We also call halakha, which means kind of the way to go, instruction. Sabbath, laws around blessings, laws around food, laws around the temple instruments. And they ask, well, how do we interpret this ruling on how far you can carry something on the Sabbath according to these various circumstances? How wide of a courtyard can I have before it becomes impermissible to carry something across it, right? And so the Mishnah then records a variety of interpretations around that, right? And there's various opinions. And then they settle on one, but sometimes they say, well, in this case, it could be this, in this case, it could be that. Okay. Usually majority opinion wins, though, but the minority opinion is also respected. But what the rabbis are trying to say is our interpretation here is authoritative. And so what begins to emerge is a notion of both what we call written Torah, the Torah given at Sinai, and oral Torah, or the interpretation of Torah, which is really the rabbinic interpretation. But then they turn around and say, actually, this interpretation was also given at Sinai. So the example that I just encapsulated here is contained in the first passage from Mishnah Avot. And can I read that?
Yeah.
Just to hear that. It says, Moses received Torah at Sinai, and he transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, the 70 elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. We can identify that with the Sanhedrin. And the men of the great assembly said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence for the Torah. So when it says Moses received Torah at Sinai and he transmitted Joshua, the transmission isn't like the tablets of the law, because that's given to everyone. It's the interpretation of Torah itself, so the oral interpretation. So what the rabbis are claiming is what we have here in this whole collection of the Mishnah actually comes from Sinai. So we could see that in a way as a mirror to, for Christians, the creation of orthodoxy in the 2nd through 4th centuries, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of definitive interpretations of the apostles' teachings that they transmitted and received from Jesus himself, right? And if we just want to think about parallel process.
Yeah, because if you think about it, if you just handed someone the New Testament and said, come on, don't you want to go hang out at Constantinople? They're going to get to Constantinople and be like, where did you get the Trinity from? And what's a homoousios? And
right.
Like,
for real.
But if you're embedded in a religious tradition and you read the sacred text, it always comes with a community of people that are inheriting interpretations and practices that shape it and all that kind of stuff. That's one of the things I find fascinating about the larger field of comparative theology and what it means for you as a scholar to get to know another religious tradition and its text and the way it lives somewhere else, to then cultivate a dialogue partner. That's a real gift. It's like the first time you learn another language, your own language is different.
Yeah. My understanding of grammar got a lot better when I had to understand Latin grammar. I'm like, oh, that's what a gerund is. I think what you say is absolutely right on kind of two levels. First, that sense of like tradition. I think for me as an Anglican, I think for Roman Catholics as well, we'd really identify with this notion of a chain of transmission, right? Like we really buy into that notion of apostolic authority. Maybe less comfortable in a free church context. But then the field of comparative theology. I went to Boston College, which is where part of the field of comparative theology really developed, with Frank Clooney, who's now at Harvard. And Frank Clooney says, the study of comparative theology is essentially going to another tradition and trying to learn it as well as you can, as if it is almost your own home tradition, right? You try to learn a text. You try to do this deep dive. I have the image of being like a scuba diver going deep under the ocean, right? I try to go down as far as I can before I have to come back up to the surface. And so when you go deep into another tradition, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, the idea is you come back up to the surface of your own tradition, and then you begin to reflect on what you've seen and learned and say, what can I learn about my own world based on what I've learned here? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really powerful because you're not trying to like reconcile truth claims. You're trying to understand your truth claims in light of another tradition's truth claims. This is what's appealing for me for this kind of move versus some other forms of religious pluralism, like say John Hick for something, mm-hmm. where you begin to just reduce everything to like kind of a truth, right? Here you're putting the things in a fruitful tension. So you get into a dialectic, which I find way more interesting.
One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about it in relationship to your work is, especially with a text that's commenting on a text that we also have a different relationship to, but it's not our text, right? Yeah. It reminds me of when you get really, really good advice about your family or marriage or whatever from someone who's in a different generation and has a very different family. But what you realize when they're talking to you is the thing you're after, and you're only framing it and with your family in mind and your frame of reference. There's actually wisdom from it. From others who have lived through figuring out what it means to bring two different families' weirdness together, form your own, and then like have children that you both love, but then you're also carrying your own baggage and trying to figure out how to do it. And sometimes once you realize that this thing you prize can be edified by someone without no one thinks we're going to switch families unless it's that weird wife swap reality show. But like short of that, like all of a sudden there's solidarity precisely because you're different, and there's wisdom to be gained. And I thought that's kind of what I saw going on, because you took the specificities of their exegetical wrestling like on their own terms, and not going, here's what they think about God, and it's similar to this Christian person who says,
I use this phrase a lot when I talk about this with people, is I'm really interested in getting to the points of irreducible difference. Mm-hmm. So I think when you get to the points of irreducible difference, that's when it gets interesting. And it's not to say that, I think sometimes people misunderstand that because they're uncomfortable with difference, right? But difference is good, right? God creates a differentiated creation. And then says, that's good. And so looking at difference is a way of having another insight into revelation itself, I think, into what God is up to in the world. And then becomes a blessing for us. Mm-hmm. And I think that learning itself, I think I got from Judaism, right? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former head rabbi for England, I think has a book called The Dignity of Difference, right? And so being comfortable with difference, I think, is something that's cultivated within comparative theology as a methodology also. So I think these two things like come together really comfortably. And I think that layers on to my own Anglican perspective of saying, we're going to have some diversity in here, and that's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. So when you, any chance you could talk about the floating skull passage? That was
the floating skull passage by Rabbi Hillel.
It's 2:6. I wrote down it was 2:6. Vote 2:6.
Yeah.
Like you know how and I don't know how to turn this off, but if you're a preacher and you're reading books and then like something comes up and you think about it the next day, like the image of a floating skull and discussion of drowning with it, then you say to yourself, I don't know how I'm going to preach it, but I'm going to use it. Plus, you know how many cool preacher points you get when you quote like an ancient Jewish rabbi once said. See,
Jewish rabbi, man, you know what? There's nothing that Christians love more than ancient Jewish rabbis, right?
Yeah, I mean,
so especially evangelicals, right?
Oh, they love it. They love it. Yeah. I mean, all of a sudden they're like, yeah. I mean, who doesn't want a floating? And it's a skull too, because that's like got a little hardcore in it.
Yeah, so that's about 2.7 actually, not 2.6. Okay. But Rabbi Hillel, who was about our generation before Jesus, active, right? He saw a skull floating on the surface of the water. He said to it, "Because you drowned someone, you were drowned. In the end, those who drowned you will be drowned." Like, that's pretty metal, right?
Yeah.
So I actually dodged commenting on that in the commentary itself because I was like, I got nothing here. And my editor said, "You don't need to comment on everything, Dan. This book is too long." So, but what that text is talking about, one of the themes of Avot, which is that God is the righteous judge, right? This is a place where I think especially Protestants get super anxious because they begin to see what they think is works righteousness happening here. That if you act righteously, you'll be saved. And if you don't act righteously, you're going to be condemned, right? And so there can be a view of the rabbis saying, store up all your works, store up all your works. But another level, Hillel's just saying in a different mode what Jesus talks about with what you reap is what you sow. There was a man who built a tower, right? And there was a man who set up a barn for all of his goods. There's a sense in Hillel here of, you see that one who's died, who was a thief, he got what he deserved, and the one who killed him is going to get what he deserved. That's a little hard. But there's also a truth in there about how sin works in the world, right? And so that gets us close to, I think, some of the hard sayings of Jesus as well, right? The ones we have to skirt around a little bit.
Yeah, and the like, because it's a skull,
yeah,
right? Like there's no dot that undoes. This is a metaphor. You know what I mean? Like to me,
no parable here.
Yeah, it's a skull, and there's in the interesting way in which skulls have functioned in European art post World War II, kind of like after where you're in art trying to wrestle with the death of God, meaning, and that type of stuff. This floating skull functioning as like the moment to remind you, like, you're in a system where death breeds death breeds death breeds death. And in some sense, the picking up of the skull gives you the opportunity to choose a different pattern. And yet, what do we end up doing? We kind of become its victim. So you pass on the same habits and patterns of death to the next generation. The victim becomes a violator, and then the violator becomes the victim, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think part of what Avot is trying to do here is there's some later passages that talk also about the reality of impending death, and talks about the cultivation of virtue. And the cultivation of virtue, which in Hebrew is called midot, is emblematic. It's the outcome of keeping Torah. If you keep Torah, you will also develop virtue. And that's not very far off from what you're going to find in Christian writings coming out from, let's say, Clement of Alexandria, who is also talking about, the way of following Jesus. And he lays out really clear precepts in the Clement's passage, the pedagogue, right? Of like all these like ethical behaviors to engage in that are really about daily life, vegetarianism, for instance, that map on really well to like what's happening here with Hillel pointing to a skull as kind of an instructive teaching moment.
Mm-hmm. So how do you, or what did you learn about how sacred texts function as a Christian and as an Episcopalian by learning how they functioned for Rabbinic Judaism and how those rabbinic texts function today?
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I was approached by Catherine Cornell, the series editor, to do this commentary, this series launched in 2005, right when I was finishing my PhD. And, this was completed recently in this book, which tells you how long it took me to actually get around to writing it and then finishing it. She said, well, we have this commentary series, Christian commentaries on non-Christian sacred texts, and we want you to do the Jewish one, which to me was a great honor. And I said, well, what do you mean by a Jewish sacred text? Because, of course, we were talking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and I think we've written a lot of Christian commentaries on that, right? So I had to think about what is an emblematic text for Judaism that's also really would be accessible enough to write on, which is how I got to Avot. Mm-hmm. But what Avot really is about Torah itself, which brings us back to a shared text. And for me, that got to a wrestling about what does Torah mean for Christians? What's the status of Torah? And here, I don't mean like the Old Testament, right? I'm trying to like make this different than our assumptions, right? What do the 613 commandments in Torah? Well, they mean for Christians. Maybe they don't need to mean anything. But I got stuck on one question, which is, do Christians even keep the 10 Commandments? Because do we really keep the Sabbath? And that's one where I've like really begun to struggle with. Have Christians, by following this kind of Pauline interpretive path of saying most of Torah is not binding for Gentiles, the 613 commandments, which I think I accept. I'm stuck on what we say about the 10 commandments. That's a moral law. And then all our stores are open on Sundays. I grew up in Connecticut, which had the old Puritan blue laws, where stores weren't open on Sundays. And then I remember when stores did open in the early 80s. And then I remember when they started selling liquor on Sundays, right? And there's a sense of a desacralization of time, which, we could talk about modernity and time all day long around this. Mm-hmm. But it makes me sad in a way that we have so devalued Torah that we don't even know what it says fully. So let me give you an example. In the daily office, the Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church in the back, we have the daily office readings, right? So if you do morning prayer every day, here's the readings for the day, depending on what part of the liturgical time you're in. So recently, we've been going through Exodus. We got to the giving of the 10 Commandments, and then we just skipped Exodus 21 through like 33. Like all of the Book of the Covenant, which is 22 through 24, and then all of the commandments of building the tabernacle and the priesthood, and all of that, we just skipped and went right to the golden calf episode, which is a problem on two levels. First, we think the Word of God's not important to read all of, which I have a problem with, just as like a Christian. And then second, we did a very Christian supersessionist thing. We skipped from the giving of the 10 Commandments to showing how Israel was not faithful enough in keeping it. Mm-hmm. And skipped over what they were faithful about, which is what they created a priesthood. And they created a tabernacle eventually out of these commandments. So that's a very long answer to your question. But I think for me, my heightened attention to Torah on Jewish terms troubles me for the question of what Torah is on Christian terms.
Mm. No, that's really helpful. How does the way, like as a comparative theologian stepping back from it, how did you rework your understanding of Revelation? And do you think it's different if you're thinking through a kind of category that's exists in all the in religions in different ways when you have these two religions that are so close historically, share certain texts and things, that to do comparative theology and think through Revelation, when a lot of the anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism in Christianity is connected to the way we prioritize our own.
Yeah. I mentioned this in the conclusion when I'm talking about kind of what's the relationship between Israel and the church. And I asked that question, like, if I use a phrase to refer to Israel in parts of the commentary, that it's a community of grace, that the ways in which we see the rabbis interpreting what Torah means and how it's about discerning how to further follow God's will, and talking about the benefits and blessings that follow from that. And I say, like, this clearly is a community of grace, right? So if there's ongoing graced action in the life of Israel, how does that relate to the church? And that gets to the question of revelation then. If God has revelation continuing through the life of Israel, and however we're going to define ongoing revelation in the life of the church, I think that's still happening. I also then try to work backwards and say, what's happening at Sinai through a Christian lens? So as an Episcopalian and a priest, I affirm the Nicene Creed and a Trinitarian theology, right? So there's a way in which I can't just bracket the Trinity from God's ongoing work with Israel. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that early Christian theologians try to do this was say that the work of the Logos is what we see revealed at Sinai, right? It's God the Word delivering it, which means it's actually the Son delivering it, which means Jesus Christ. Justin Martyr, others tried to use that in a very supersessionist way, saying, see, Jesus came, the Son the Logos gave this then, now the Logos kind of perfects this now in the incarnation. And I tried to short circuit that move. And I say, well, what does it mean to have Logos as Torah operating over here and Logos as incarnate Son happening over here? And I feel like I'm still in the realm of theological speculation there. I don't want to pin that down yet. I think that's kind of the next iteration of the project, is to say, how can we talk about Torah and Logos in a Trinitarian way that's also not supersessionist?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good question. My next book that's about to come out of a chapter about it. Not framed exactly that way, but the whole way of redoing Logos Christology was to avoid that.
Yeah.
Because I recognize there's a problem. And for me, the way it popped up was in that the class I took in undergrad, when I realized, I don't even know why I thought this, short of the fact that why would a Christian that grow up in the rural South think about the reality of other religions when you weren't sure Presbyterians were Christians?
Much less Episcopalians.
Well, I have never met one of those in real life. I just knew they like liquor. I knew that.
That's a brand.
Yeah, I knew, and it was nice liquor. But the moment you realize that at the very time, the New Testament is being what documents make it in the New Testament, how the Gospels are being written, and all this stuff is going on. You see this beautiful parallel reconstruction of the identity of Israel post-temple, where they are inheriting this beautiful, rich tradition, and they are thinking through what it means to then recenter one's religious life outside of the cultic patterns of temple, but to the rhythm of daily life in Torah in the home and in the synagogue. Then it's just really hard for a Protestant who wins sword drill champs, because you memorize the Bible and read it all the time, to then not think that's probably a good thing that you take Torah and you give it to everybody and tell them studying the Bible is a good idea and it makes you more holy. Because that's literally we didn't have no creeds as Baptists. Like you got baptized, and then you get a Bible and you learn to read it and wrestle with it and pray. And so everything I was learning that Rabbinic Judaism was doing was what I thought was being a good Christian meant. And then you start to read and you're like, Jesus uses that material. And then your rabbi professor's like, no, Jesus borrowed our material trip. Okay. But unless you're willing to like really cut the branch, right? Just the act of getting to know the vibrancy of emerging Rabbinic Judaism means you can't tell the Christian story of Revelation the same way.
Right. And then that becomes the question of the next chain. So what do I do about Islam, right? And its claims about, I often tell Christians, if you want to know what supersessionism feels like listen to traditional Islamic views on Christianity, where they're like, no, Muhammad's like the final one, and we're perfecting everything that came later. And you're like, wait a minute. And I've not yet dealt with, how do I deal with Islam? How do I deal with Buddhism? How do I deal with indigenous religions? You look at an Anglican theologian like the late John Mbidi, who talks about, God was in Africa before you English folks showed up, and let me show you how Christianity and African traditional religion connect, right? So I think there we're getting into the question of communication of grace, right? How is God communicating gracefully to all people? We have Justin Martyr dealing with this very question in the Second Apology. He's like, Plato, God was there. And the question for Christians is, how is God perfecting it? And I think when we get to a category like Islam, which is a later religion, that's where some really interesting wrestling happens then. Wait, if that's emerging after Christ versus if we're dealing with, say, indigenous traditions.
Well, I mean, I also think a lot of times when we talk about comparative theologies, what we're comparing are the most sophisticated, beautiful written expressions of a religious tradition. But the overwhelming majority of religious practitioners in history did not read Houston Smith's beautiful rendition of every religious tradition, resonate with one, and then join as a free agent.
Right.
The tradition they're born into was their means to connecting to whatever the depth dimension is, and taught them what it meant to relate to text and to community different and to love and to make sense of life transitions and all these types of things that somehow like the lived practice of religion and the individuals within it, I have less trouble making sense of than thinking about it in some abstracted way.
Yeah, it's not like we're going to put Aquinas, Avicenna, Maimonides together and just like, may the best man win.
And what's funny is, if you know them all well enough, you imagine if you gave them 10 years hanging out, they would all come out like best friends and not know what the big deal was, because they were like brilliantly creative, synthetic thinkers, and would have recognized it in the other.
Yeah.
Well, two of them I know like had that mystical moment where they just kind of were like, I'm done writing.
Yeah. We're out. I attend an annual interfaith seminary retreat here in Texas. All the various seminaries in Texas that are part of our larger statewide consortium meet up on the Red River. And seminarians from American Jewish University in LA, which is a conservative outfit, and then local Islamic training students come together. And so you have future kind of clergy, religious leaders of very diverse traditions, from, Missionary and Baptist Alliance to, your Anglicans to your Presbyterians and Muslims, Jews, and that lived experience. And what happens is each tradition offers a worship service that people observe and participate in as they feel comfortable. And when people hear the same depth of prayer, commitment, spirituality, commitment to God, it breaks down so many barriers. And we don't have to worry about the truth claims anymore. We can begin to partner.
And the truth claims function different, right? Like, I think one of the things that I found powerful about the idea of writing commentary on someone else's sacred text and doing it with the kind of care of not wanting to bear false witness to your neighbor that you demonstrate is that, like, if you sat and described how you fell in love with your partner I could recognize that as a beautiful love story without wanting to date her. That's how it works, you know? And I could tell you about how Alicia and I fell in love, and the same thing could be true. If you're an analytic theologian dealing with some text, then all of a sudden sacred texts start to look like geometry or algebraic equations.
Yeah. When
they function for the religious believer much more like a love poem. One of the compelling things about the book itself is inviting you to read it not as the outsider reads it, but with the love and attentiveness of someone who is seized by the tradition and what is that text carries.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of what Catherine Tarrant talks about, non-competitive transcendence, right? From a Christian perspective, if God is a relationship of being, fundamentally love, and then we're called into relationality, then we're also being called to relationality with all people, right? And so attending faithfully and lovingly to another in itself is also an expression of love, right? I think that's part of what I think comparative theology offers, that kind of faithful, loving witness bearing, right?
Definitely. So the last question I had was, what was your unanticipated insight? When you think of the years and time you've put into this project, what was the unanticipated insight that made you hesitate, change, challenge your own convictions you brought in?
An unanticipated insight here. This operates for me on a couple of different levels. I think one is the humility, how much humility I actually need to do this work well, right? I initially thought, I am just going to read this document, this text. I'm just going to comment on it. I started trying to do that. I'm like, I know nothing. One of the insights I got towards the end is I am probably one of the few Christians who know this much about rabbinic Judaism, right? There's probably 200 Christians of all North America know as much about rabbinic Judaism as I do. And I actually know nothing about it. So that sense of real deep humility was one. I end my conclusion on that note. I think the other one, while I was writing this commentary, I was also doing the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, what they call the 19th annotation. So I was doing it while living in the world over about a 9-month period of time. Part of what the exercises do is call you into a deep relationship with Jesus Christ. And I was getting to know Jesus Christ closer and closer as my friend, as my Lord, as my Savior, and really the one who I'm fundamentally drawn to. So this got uncomfortable for me because I'm like, I think I'm more into Jesus now at the end of this commentary than at the beginning. And this is one of the things I've been really transparent when doing dialogue work with Jews. When I'm on a panel, I'm the Christian who says really clearly, I believe and follow Jesus Christ and I'm a disciple of him, without doing all of the, now would you like to know Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? I think I've uncoupled that move, not because I don't think it's important, but because I recognize God's ongoing grace work in the life of Israel, the Jewish community. So in a way, I think Frank Clooney, this is part of what Frank Clooney talks about in some of his early work on comparative theology. When comparative theology is done well, it deepens your own commitments to your home tradition. And for me, that was a real grace and a real gift at the end.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. So what's the next move for you intellectually? What are you working on next?
Yeah, I think the big thing I want to work on in this field is really a book for the church on what are the concrete ways in which we can recognize, still ongoing anti-Jewish bias, practice, unfortunate habits and texts we've still retained, whether it's, Advent hymns or really bad lectionary sequencing or like really unreflective Sunday school material, and figure out how to like shake that, how to recognize it, and not just like shame people about it, but then like recommend concrete, helpful steps forward. I'm really interested in developing a non-supersessionist Christian theology as a whole. There's lots of us who are interested in that right now. I want to give something back to the church. I think as a seminary professor, I have a responsibility to teach for the church, not just for my seminarians. And I want to keep on gnawing on this question of how does Logos relate to Torah? And I love to read what you come up with. I know there's some other good material that's come out recently as well around this.
Sounds great. Well, I really enjoyed getting to meet you and hear from you. And once you want to talk about it more, just let me know. And who knows, the Anglican Twitter may get really upset about something one of us said, and we'll just have to have another podcast to clarify it.
Well, hashtag WAT, weird Anglican Twitter. Yeah. Hey, it was great getting to know you. I hope you do well up there in Edinburgh. Hope you ride this wave out all right.
It was a blast. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Love it. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.